We are back here at the Cyber Executive Podcast, where we speak to top industry experts about risk, technology, and leadership, and really whatever we want to talk about. So, I am your host, Marc Ashworth, and today I have the pleasure of having my good friend Gretchen Pettet, who is the Assistant Vice President and Senior Talent Development at Commerce Bank, with me here today. Gretchen, thanks for joining me today on the Cyber Executive Podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, so we've known each other for a while, and then I always follow you on LinkedIn as well, and your comments around leadership and mentoring and coaching and all that stuff has just really been very encouraging. And so I thought, hey, I gotta get you on here to talk.
Yeah.
Join with a bunch of the other great leaders that we've had on here to talk about various things like that. So.
Terrific. I appreciate the opportunity. I will tell you, I'm passionate about the work I get to do. And so anytime I have a captive audience, even if only one, I'm delighted.
Well, let's hope it grows well past one then at this point. So let's, all right. So cool. So, in, your years of coaching and everything, and, whether it's a sales team, engineering, operations, technical, whatever it might be, how do you recommend, the leader of that group to, rally the team and to get to a unified goal?
That's such a great question, Mark. I think one of the things that's always been a guiding principle for me is really just understanding that you can't motivate other people to achieve your goal. And so it really is around creating buy-in. And that's dependent on having a team or an organization of people who trust you, who trust each other, who understand the purpose and really buy into what it is you're trying to do, and maybe even more importantly, why you're trying to do it. And so I think really that understanding that, this might start as my vision or my goal, but I have to build a team of people who are equally as inspired by and excited about that goal in whatever capacity that looks like. It could be on a personal level, it can be on a professional level. And that's really, I think, one of the greatest opportunities that leaders have to really change the speed of the organization and drive organizations forward.
Yeah, I agree. And part of that is, building those relationships with the team as well as, with others around them, whether it's other executives or other stakeholders in there, or maybe it's someone even outside of the organization. So, what's some tips that you've given to, provide and help foster those strong professional relationships?
I think it's really for me it's twofold. I think first and foremost it's about authenticity, and it's really it's knowing yourself, knowing your own vision, knowing what you're trying to achieve, and then surrounding yourself with people who are equally inspired by that and want to be a part of it. And so it's not just the authenticity, but it's the sense of belonging or the sense of commitment that comes as a result of really being transparent, really being present, really being your authentic self when you're talking about, they really ultimately start out as dreams and visions and they become business strategy. And we've got, I think people don't buy, every business starts out with a great idea, but we've got to want that person or that business to succeed. And we've got to want to contribute in a meaningful and valuable way, or, where you're just a lone ranger. You're just out there, you're not really a leader. You're just out there, working hard and pushing forward and probably not making any forward or significant forward strides. And so I think, if you really reflect on the leaders who have become almost icons of leadership, it's because they built something that people wanted to be a part of. And I think that doesn't happen by accident. It happens by knowing your folks. It happens by connecting with your folks. It happens by, helping them understand what you're building or what you're chasing, and having them on board and having them equally as committed in whatever capacity that looks like. There's Peter Drucker always shared this analogy about the cathedral builders. I'm sure you've probably heard it at some point, and I'm going to butcher it. But the premise is, he walked up. So think think prehistoric Greece, if you will, or prehistoric Rome. And he walks up to these three masons, and it's like, what are you doing? And the one's like, well, I'm building a cathedral. And, the other one is like, well, I'm putting the bricks down. And the third one's like, I am building a place where, we can worship and celebrate and contribute. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, we can do whatever the job it is, but it's really recognizing that even if I'm a maintenance man, or if I am an accountant, that it's contributing to something bigger that they want to be a part of and they want to contribute to in a meaningful level.
Yeah, very true. And, that strategy or that vision that the leader is trying to present there, it comes with, managing expectations and deliverables in that relationship. So in what ways, you brought up a lot of great points on, needing to have that strategy or that vision, but what ways can a manager, or maybe not even a manager, maybe, just someone else, to help deliver that message in that work relationship, what the expectations of what some deliverables might be?
I think we probably underestimate in 2025. I think we probably underestimate the power of, or the importance of, really sound communication. I think we've relied so much on, I'm sitting here, my phone is here, and I've got a chat window here, and right now I'm blocking that out. But because we have so many avenues for communication, I think sometimes we take it for granted, and we make some assumptions that when I am communicating my expectations to you, for example, that you understand them, or that you think they're right, or that you are willing to act on them. And so I think one of them is just really good old fashioned basic communication, and knowing your folks well enough that, I mean, we really do all, I'm one of those people, call me Pollyanna. I am one of those people that genuinely believe that people want to do good work. They want to add value. And when we as leaders can help communicate or align those expectations with something that matters for the employee or the team member, I really do think that that's where the magic happens. We can take, regardless of what my role is, I think most people, they want to do a good job, and so therefore they have to know what a good job is, and they have to know, the what and why behind, this is what's expected, and this is why it matters, and this is how we're going to measure it. And really having that confirmation that what they understand is what you intended. And that if we can clarify that, and we are in alignment on what that means and how it contributes to that bigger picture, I think that's where the most, it really is where the best work happens. And research shows it's really where the most effective work happens, and where the most successful organizations are, or how they're grown, if you will. It's hard. It takes a lot of work. It takes a whole team of people who are, because it doesn't have to just be the leader. If I'm a CEO of a large organization, chances are I've not met a lot of the people that work with me, but is your team on board? Do they get the vision? Are they supportive of? Do they have clarity and comprehension about what it is you're trying to achieve, how it is you're going to achieve it, and why it matters? Because they become ambassadors for your brand if you're the CEO, or your vision. So you got to make sure, I think, as a leader, you've got to make sure you're surrounded by people who also really, really get it, who really, really buy in. And that's where that authenticity and belonging, I'm going to keep coming back to that, because I think it's so critical. There is a lot of research right now that shows, in this post-COVID world, that, the National Institutes of Health, for example, say that we are in a crisis of loneliness. Well, loneliness is just the absence of connection. And so a real meaningful, even a discussion like this, can go a really long way in motivating people and inspiring people, and making sure that, they're on board.
Absolutely. And, I think most people don't wake up in the morning and say, I am going to do a terrible job today. you know
Nobody does that. We totally agree.
And so, I think most people, like you said, wants to do a good job, and they want to be inspired, and they want to, have that big picture of what's going on and what they can do to make their job better, and everything else around them and stuff. But that still there's challenges with that, and whether you're a manager or executive, sometimes you have to communicate those challenges and do that in a way that uh, doesn't bring the team down, but still deliver the urgency of what might need to be done. So, what's some ways to provide those messages whenever it comes to challenges and maybe what's happening in the organization or the project?
So two things come immediately to mind, Mark. I think the first one is courage, and the second is candor. I remember reading. I can't take credit for it, but I can't remember who to assign credit to. There was a quote one time that um, candor is kindness, and I think we've got this mistaken understanding in our world today that kindness and nice are the same thing, and that's not necessarily the truth. Sometimes sharing the really hard facts with you, as uncomfortable as it might be, is the kindest thing I can do. So if I come back and say we're not meeting our target or your performance is off track, what I'm doing is saying, first of all, I trust you enough that I can be forthcoming with you and recognize that we're going to be able to fix this. Now that's on a one-on-one level, but I think the same thing can be done at a department, team, or organization level. And it really is about, it's about telling them what you know. And sometimes telling them what you know is that you don't know everything either. I've worked with a lot of organizations through some really tough times. This was probably 20 years ago, but I worked for a company that we were on a product allocation. And essentially, we were going to have to ration what people could sell and what we could make available to our customers. And the first thing we did is said, we have to communicate this. We have to literally tell them, this is what we know. And some of what we know is that we don't know everything, such as when's the allocation going to end. And so I think that recognizing that sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is to speak the truth quickly, even though that might require a lot of courage, is the kindest, most effective thing we can do. And so I really do. I'm one of those people that believes there is a place, for kindness in our business world. In fact, I think it really is what makes some of the most outstanding companies produce the results they do.
Yeah, and I've been in leadership for 25 years or more or whatever, and all throughout there's been budget cuts or layoffs and those sort of things, and having to deliver those sort of messages, usually because since I was in IT or security, we knew about it ahead of time in order to prepare, for, layoffs and stuff, and
Yep.
to cut access and everything. And so,
Yep.
having to deliver those messages, and in some cases, knowing maybe someone on the team might be part of that, but not able to share that, is really difficult to, be open and honest as much as you can. And have them feel and see the empathy off of it, because it's not a pretty situation in some cases.
It's not, Mark. And I'll tell you, a lot of the work I've done has also been within the talent or HR areas. And so, kind of similar, you often know what's coming. And it's not often something you want to know. It's like, gosh, I wish I didn't have to know this. I also think there's something really powerful for leaders to really own how they're feeling. And I will offer that, even when I started in this field 30 years ago, I feel like, which is absurd to even say those numbers out loud. But when I started 30 years ago, I think there was still a very different perspective of how leaders showed up. And so I think sometimes those conversations, and it's the same advice, honestly, that I give my young adult children is, something's hard for you. Say it's hard for you. This is hard for me to tell you. That really can go a long way in connecting with others and influencing how they receive the bad news, if it's bad news. But the same can be true as, if I'm giving you a promotion, or if our stock's performing really well, it's like, I'm so excited to share this with you. We are human beings, and human beings have feelings, and I'm not asking, like I always say, there's no crying in baseball. That's not what I'm looking for. But I think really like, you know, this stinks. And I hate to be the one to tell you this. And I'm just going to say it straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes being that bold then creates the space to have a really meaningful conversation instead of just being burdened by what's this bad news I know? What's this awful information I have to share with you? Because it does allow you to create a connection on a human level as opposed to just the business level.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it's whether it's good news or bad news, you want to either be excited or not excited depending on the topic. And there's always going to be mistakes in presentation off of it. And so what's some of those common mistakes that leaders should avoid, just in general, whenever it's around communication?
I will always, I say, we tell our kids no, always and never, but I will share them more often than not. We've got to avoid making assumptions. And, the assumption can be as simple as me, assuming that I know what you think I mean, or it could be the same that like the assumption could be we have clarity around what I'm communicating. The assumption could be that, Mark is a good person and he's going to take this well because he's a real company man. Whatever it is, we have to be willing to say those things to eliminate that ambiguity. So there is a model that I use a lot, and it really is, and sometimes the language stands in the way it's of effectiveness, but it's from a company called Crucial, and they teach this model of sharing my story and asking for you to share your story. And so we not only hear, but then we create a shared understanding of what both of our stories are. So, years and years ago, I remember showing a videotape. Yes, that's how long ago. It was literally a VHS tape. And there was this man, and he's driving down this country kind of road. If I had to guess, it literally was like on the Scottish countryside. I mean, that's literally what it looks like. And he rounds the bend on this little 2-lane road, and a woman's coming around the corner the other way, and she yells at him, and she's like, yells out of the car window, and she's like, "Pig!" And he's like, you can literally see his whole demeanor. He's like, "Why'd she call me a pig?" Well, he rounds the bend and there's a pig in the road. And so, the assumption there is that we had the same understanding of what he thought she meant, but we don't. And we never will unless we ask, unless we say, that's a lighthearted example, but unless we say things like, when you said pig out loud at me and kind of gestured, I thought you were calling me a pig. What were you really thinking? You can't have that conversation on the side of the road. But the point is, oh, I wasn't calling you a pig. I was trying to tell you there was a pig. And so I think, it's a silly example of something that I see happen in personal relationships, professional relationships, the public sector. We all just assume we know. And truth be told, we are wired for those kind of assumptions. They are literally, it's the neurological, wiring that built us to survive. And so we do it without even thinking. We just really need to reflect on and confirm the assumption I drew was, or the story I'm telling myself is. And I think sometimes those phrases, they become the tool. They become the skill that we can use. As the story I'm telling myself is, you were calling me names. Well, no, I wasn't. I was trying to warn you of a large hog in the road. So, yeah, I think avoid making assumptions.
Most go to the negative versus the positive intent, and it's a lot challenging to have that mindset to do that. And
Mark, I'll add too. I think one of the things that we forget, and we do a lot of work around emotional intelligence. I like to call it relational awareness, because I think sometimes emotion is still kind of like taboo, or the idea of emotion. But one of the things to remember is that we don't process emotion through our logical brain at all. And so if somebody's rounding that bend and they yell pig and we respond in anger, it then has to, once it's passed through, it's literally a response. Like when you're having it's a reflex. So like when you're having your reflexes checked. So I think even just recognizing that we're going to have the emotion. It's up to us as a leader. It's up to us as, even an individual who aspires to be a leader. to recognize that, yep, that was my reaction. What's the story that drew that reaction? And then pausing to say, hey, is this what you meant by that?
Yeah. Yeah. And, in that conversation might lead to a tough conversation on top of that. So how can you handle, what's some tips to handling those tough conversations? And maybe it's a one-on-one, maybe it's in a group scenario.
Yeah, I would say, off the cuff, two things come immediately to mind. The first is, praise in public, and coach in private. And so, if you've got something you want to correct, usually one-on-one is going to be the best way to go. I would also offer that at the heart of being really effective when you have to share corrective feedback or you have to, provide performance coaching, it goes, your effectiveness is going to be determined by that relationship. And so, have you connected with them authentically? Do they feel a sense of belonging? Do they trust you? And I'm not talking like, oh yeah, I'd let you watch my dog, but like, are they going to trust you with their self-confidence and there's a term called psychological safety, and it's that I can be myself in front of you. I can be vulnerable, even if it means, wow, I screwed that up and I deserve the feedback that I'm getting. And so, unfortunately for leaders, you don't build that in the moment you need it. It's something you have to have crafted all along, because at the point that you really need to call on somebody's feelings of psychological safety, you've either built it or you've not. And you don't want to, you need to, we talk sometimes about a trust bank account. Like, do they trust you? Have you created a workspace or a team or an organization where people can take a risk? People do know their work is valued. People can mess up. That's a huge part of innovation. Am I comfortable taking a calculated or measured risk? And I've worked with organizations through the years where the answer to that is no. Same. And so it's an unfortunate place. So I think this is such an important discussion, because it's something I always tell people, like, when I think about leadership skills, and not actually the role of leadership, when I think about the things that make people effective, it's not necessarily something you can do. It's how you do everything. How do you receive bad news? How do you give bad news? How do you communicate bad news? And all of those things are really what create the byproduct, if you will, of your effectiveness as a leader at any level, really.
Yeah, and I think it was Covey that talked about making deposits, and those sort of things, emotional deposits. So whenever the bad things happen, there you can take some withdrawals, and it won't be
Yep.
too negative. And so that's something to keep in mind, and also, and in a previous episode where I talked to Sherry Wynn, and she was talking about the emotional deposits on yourself in the beginning, to be able, in the beginning of the day, to kind of fill your cup up in order to go out, and especially on those days is going to be tough. Yeah. So do those things to yourself to bring yourself up, so that way you can be more calm and relaxed in order to deal with the things that you're having to have those tough conversations.
It is the, professional version of put your mask on first. It's if you've traveled in an airplane with small children, they give the instructions on the front end and they say, you've got to put your own oxygen mask on before you put it on your children, because you've got to take care of yourself to take care of others. I can't understate that. There's no overstating that. Like, our effectiveness as a leader really is, I think, a reflection of how we care for ourselves. How we care for others is a reflection of how we care for ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. We've been talking a lot around misunderstandings, miscommunications, work relationships. So, how do you handle those situations off there? I know you kind of gave some tidbits, kind of more general, but more specifically around those situations of misunderstanding or miscommunications. How could a leader help correct that course and maybe get it to a more positive note?
Yeah, I think, so let's make some assumptions here that, we've done the work and we've got a trusting relationship and we're willing to connect, with people authentically. And I think it's having those tough conversations. I think it's erring on the side of candor and not nice. I we always say feedback's a gift. And if I respect you, you deserve to know. Whatever that is. And so we've got to be willing to have those conversations. And I've worked with leaders through the years who shy away from, who are uncomfortable with that. And I would counter that you're not leading if you're not having the hard conversations too. I can stand on the sidelines and be a cheerleader. Or I can be the coach that's actually going to tell you, you took your eye off the ball, or, I'm probably the last person to be making sports analogies, but my point is, I've got to have those hard conversations. And, I go back to that idea about my story and your story, and it really is around, and these conversations can be so hard that sometimes I instruct people or suggest to people that you literally make a list of some of these phrases, because when you can start a sentence with, what my story is, or what were you like, I call them, they're kind of like ready phrases, and you've got them like, in your holster on your hip, and you're ready to pull them out. They create space for the kind of conversation you have to get through these difficult times, especially when you'd rather not. I hate conflict. I think it's why I, like to do the coaching and I like to do the consulting. It's very easy for me to tell you what you should do, and not as easy necessarily for me to always be the one that does it, because it is uncomfortable. But you have to get comfortable with the discomfort if you're going to be an effective leader, if you truly want people to be successful. Again, and I've said this to leaders before. Like I recently had a conversation with somebody, and we were working on identifying, helping someone as part of a succession plan, but they were having a little bit of a hiccup right now. And the first question I said is, do you want to keep them? Do you want to keep them? Are you going through the motion? And the answer was like, yeah, I want to keep her. I said, great. That's what, then we're going to act like it, because then she deserves to know the truth. She deserves the support. She deserves the resources, because you want to keep her and you already think she can be successful. That's when we do the most, the best for our people, is when we are having those tough conversations so that they can be successful, so that they can be effective, so that they can contribute in the best way possible.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think especially over maybe the past 5-7 years, I think you see more of a shift in how leaders are meeting with people. It was, when I first started, and for most of my career, you got feedback once a year, maybe.
Yep.
And I know about 10 years ago or so, I started to do a lot of leadership, self-taught leadership type things, and really kind of looking into, okay, one-on-ones and weekly meetings around goals and those sort of things. And then as, and I know I'm not the person started, because I was working for little bitty companies, but I started to kind of hear more and more people talking about that, and going towards, at least quarterly reviews, and then some doing monthly. And so, I think having those regular engagements, it helps people know what's on your mind, what's happening with them, versus you talk to them once a month or once a quarter or once a year, and not really know what's really kind of going on. And you can't react to anything that was a possible course correction. Then it's too late at that point, because they don't even remember what went wrong. I mean, you might have been stewing on for 9 months, but why didn't you talk to them 9 months ago about the thing? So,
Mark, I absolutely. And not only can they not remember what went wrong, perhaps, maybe they don't even remember what went right. And so when we're not looking at people's performance except for once a year, we're doing a disservice to them. We're doing a disservice to, our investors or our shareholders. We're doing a disservice to the organization. And I will share that, kudos to you, because you're right. We actually have seen transition in the workplace. But it was due to folks like you that first started saying, hey, this doesn't feel right, and people start practicing it and recognizing. I tell people, when I first started teaching performance management, annual review processes for both employees and leaders years ago, it literally was that. Okay, write your goals in January, and then we'll come back in December and tell us how I did.
Right.
And I always use an example, now, especially we've been through a pandemic, but there were lots of goals written in January of, was that 2020? That I can assure you were not met at the end of 2021. And if you weren't having any sort of discussion or alignment, well, was the whole year wasted? Did we literally not get any growth, any development? Did we not make any progress? Well, of course you did.
Right.
And so we've got to be able to, has this changed? Are these still the right priorities? What's standing in your way? Is it, how can I support you? And I tell leaders, I would, if somebody said, what's your recommendation? I'd say, well, you should at least be meeting monthly. And depending on the size of your team, if you can have 15 minutes every week, and here's the deal. I don't want leaders leading that meeting. I want their people leading that meeting.
Mm-hmm.
What do you need from me? That's my role as a leader. And then that person shows up and said, I'm on track this week. This is standing in the way. I can't get access to the data I need, whatever it is. It's going to save you a whole lot of time on the back end of troubleshooting what went wrong, or why didn't we meet this goal, or, oh, it's over budget. Imagine finding that out on the weekly as opposed to, quarterly or annually.
Right. Yeah. Having those touch bases and going over the goals for the upcoming week. And, I'll go back to Covey, around wigs and the whirlwind around you and that sort of things. And having them be accountable for what they're saying that they're going to do. I also, really like the 4-block, and that's the first thing we talk about in our one-on-ones. And then after we're done with the 4-block, then, we talk about whatever might else be going on. But the nice part about that is for whenever there's still that annual review, now they got 12 months of documentation. They can go back for their self-assessment and go, oh yeah, back in January, I did this. This was really cool, and they're not having to think about that. So there's that hidden agenda there of them doing that. And I think it's great.
Well, and I'd argue, let's not keep it hidden. It's the best case scenario that at the end of the year, people recognize the contributions that they made and the progress that they made toward their goals. I mean, that talk about, it goes all the way back to the first question is, how do you get other people on board with your goal? Well, you make it theirs, then they're motivated and they're excited about it and they're making a difference, day to day. So it feels like, I so badly, I love these conversations, 4-block and Covey. And I love that because that's my, I'm like, that's where I really nerd out. And the reason for it is because it works, because it makes a difference. And if, I think about if I can make a difference for one person's day or week, and then that makes a difference for, somebody on their team or somebody that they interact with as a customer or a client. It really, I just really, really believe in the power of people to make a difference. And it can be to make a difference in their day-to-day. It can be to make a difference in, whatever the organization's purpose is or their goal is. But I am optimistic enough to think that most people respond really well to that. And I would also, go so far as to say, if you're not, as a member of an organization, if you're not feeling that, then I would be asking questions around that with your leader. If your leader's not having these conversations, engage that. How does my work contribute to? I don't understand how what I do day to day influences the bottom line, or ask those kinds of questions, because that is really where it's the sweet spot, I think, of organizational.
Yeah, I do too. So here's a big question for you here. So what advice do you have for someone that's inspiring to be a leader? If maybe they're just in their first leadership job, or maybe they're in there for a long time, or maybe they're just wanting to, hey, do I want to get into a management role?
So, gosh, that is
very loaded.
I do. It is. And I will share that I have a lot of conversations like this, and I always start in the same place. It's really about some self-awareness and some reflection. Case in point, I've worked with many organizations over the years that, yes, I can stay at the organization, but there's really no development opportunity for me unless I become a team lead or unless I become a manager, whatever that is. And I would offer that that's not enough. That does not a good manager make, or not a good leader make. And so you really have to figure out, what are my strengths? What do I enjoy doing? What are my values? I had a pretty quick ascent to leadership professionally. And I also got married later. So I got married when I was about 29. And by that time, I was already a part of our leadership team at a really large wide corporation. And oh, by the way, what quickly followed marriage were 3 children. What ended up happening was, I literally remember looking at my husband one day and I said, I can't be needed this much at work, because I was needed so much at home. I had 3 children in 4 years. And so I share that just to say, what our values and what our interests are at one point in our career, it doesn't mean they don't change. And so you have to really spend some time saying, what am I good at? What do I need out of my work? Where am I happiest? The result of that discussion, although I have since been a leader, was I did take a couple of years off from managing other people while my children were very small. I went back eventually. And then by the time my girls got to high school, I was like, no, by that time, my husband was traveling extensively and his career had shifted. So we kind of had to pivot. And I share that just as an example of how what is happening in your personal life should be part of the consideration. Do we all want more money? Sure. But eventually there's a benchmark. And as long as there's that threshold that's being met, does the work, does it energize you? Is it your sweet spot? I always tell people, here's the deal. Like, can I do expense reports? Yeah. Do you want to pay me to do expense reports? No, because I hate detail. I'm disorganized. So could I do it? Sure. If my entire job was doing some kind of expense report or budgeting, I have the knowledge. I have the skills. I have the abilities. I have zero motivation. Motivation matters. And so I have to then reflect on, what are my natural strengths? What do I like? Where do I get my energy? How can I make a difference? I remember when I came into my current role, it was after my mom had died unexpectedly. And I literally remember thinking, like, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? And so I was at another one of those pivotal points. And I remember saying, when I was going through the selection process, I said, I want to do good work. I want to add value. I want to actually grow this way. But I want to finish my career. And at that point, it was going to be 10 or 12 years as an individual contributor. And I think if I'd only been chasing dollars, or if I'd only been chasing the perceived, threshold, if you will, of success, I probably would have been disappointed. And yet here I am every day. I'm like, I get to do really cool work. I don't ever wake up in the morning, Mark, and think, who am I going to tick off today? That's not where I'm living. And so when we can counsel people or coach people to make their decisions related to the career that are really purposeful and are really intentional. I always tell people, no one likes to work virtually more than me. I've done it for the majority of my career, very oddly. So it's unusual in my line of work, especially in the 90s. But there's also, as an extrovert, I need to be with people as well. And so it's that kind of self-awareness to say, yep, Gretchen, she likes it, I like some autonomy, but eventually, I need a team of people I need to connect with. And it's that level of self-awareness aligned with what you think you want. I shared with somebody, I asked people to go through an exercise, and I asked them to look at their resume, and I say, I want you to tell me something that each of these jobs has in common that's not obvious. And people struggle with this. I will give that as a coaching, assignment and ask them to come back in a month. And the things I get out of it are things like, I was the first person to be in all of these roles. or I, in each of these jobs, documented our processes. So those aren't often things that end up on people's resumes, or those aren't things that, people will often reflect on. They'll say, well, I'm an IT leader, or I'm a scrum master, whatever the case is. They identify by their title. But he said, let's look at those things like, wow, if you really were the first person in the role, what does that say about you? Well, it might say deals with ambiguity, problem solver, can figure things out, and really, again, it's a lot of work. But I will tell you that I think when people are planning their careers and looking at how they want to grow, that kind of self reflection can both save them time and frustration in the long role and in the long term, and expedite their transcendence to whatever it is they really want to do and where they can make the greatest difference professionally.
Cool. Well, Gretchen, wonderful advice, wonderful conversation. Thank you. We are out of time here for this week's episode, but thank you again for being part of the episode, and look forward to more conversations.
Love it. Thank you so much. Thanks for what you do.
Thank you. And for everyone else, be sure to subscribe and click and follow, as well as share the Cyber Executive Podcast. Until next time, thank you.
Bye, all.